What happens when a diner manager humiliates a veteran and his dog, firing a waitress for kindness? You won't believe who storms in to turn the tables. The sun hung low over Eldridge, Iowa, painting the quiet stretch of Juniper Avenue in soft golds and pinks, a fleeting promise of warmth before the day's heat settled in. Brewster's Diner, a squat red brick building with a chipped neon sign, stood as a stubborn relic of small-town America, its windows fogged with the steam of brewing coffee and sizzling griddles. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting sense of bacon, maple syrup, and slightly burnt toast, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the clatter of forks against plates. Checkered tablecloths draped the tables, some frayed at the edges, and the vinyl booths creaked under the weight of regulars who'd claimed their spots years ago. A jukebox in the corner, long silent, stood like a forgotten sentinel, its chrome dulled by time. Behind the counter, Marla Hensley, 68 years old and carrying the quiet grace of someone who'd seen the world's ugliness yet chose kindness, wiped down a sticky patch of syrup with a rag that had seen better days. Her gray hair, neatly pinned into a bun, gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights, and her faded apron bore her name in red cursive stitching, a touch of pride in an otherwise utilitarian uniform. Marla's face, lined with the stories of a life fully lived, held a warmth that drew people in. Her hazel eyes crinkled when she smiled, which was often, and her voice carried a gentle lilt that put even the grumpiest customers at ease. She'd been at Brewster's for nearly a decade, ever since her husband, Leonard, passed, leaving her with a modest home on Persimmon Lane and a heart too restless to sit idle. To the regulars, she was more than a waitress. She was a confidant, a surrogate aunt, the one who remembered how you liked your eggs and slipped an extra pancake to the kids when their parents weren't looking. But Marla was no stranger to hardship. Beneath her soft exterior lay a core of steel, forged in the jungles of Vietnam, where she'd served as an army nurse from 1967 to 1970. She'd bandaged wounds under gunfire, held the hands of dying boys, and earned a Bronze Star for dragging a wounded soldier to safety during an ambush. Those days were a lifetime ago, tucked away in a shoebox of faded letters and a single photograph of her younger self in fatigues, now gathering dust in her attic. She didn't talk about it, not because she was ashamed, but because she believed the past should speak through actions, not words. In Eldridge, she was just Marla, the woman who kept the coffee hot and the conversation light, and that suited her fine. This Tuesday morning, Marla was in her element, weaving through the diner with a coffee pot in one hand and a stack of menus under her arm. She paused at table 6, where a group of farmers in worn flannel debated the price of corn over plates of hash browns. "You boys need more cream, or you planning to argue till the cows come home?" she teased, her voice carrying a playful edge that made them chuckle. She refilled their mugs, her movements practiced and sure, when the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. In shuffled an elderly man, his steps slow but deliberate, as if each one required a moment's consideration. He was tall, but slightly stooped, his frame lean under a faded green jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders. A baseball cap with a Marine Corps emblem sat low on his brow, shielding deep-set eyes that held a quiet intensity, like a storm held at bay. His boots, scuffed and worn, whispered of countless miles, and at his side limped a scruffy dog, a mutt with a patchy graying coat and a tremble in its hind legs that spoke of age and loyalty. The man's face, weathered as old leather, bore the scars of a life hard lived, but there was a gentleness in the way he rested a hand on the dog's back, steadying it as they crossed the threshold. Marla's gaze softened as she approached, a menu in hand. "Morning, sir," she said, her voice warm as the coffee she carried. "Welcome to Brewster's. Got a nice spot by the window if you'd like, and I can fetch some water for your friend there." She nodded at the dog, whose soulful eyes met hers with a trust that tugged at her heart. The man looked up, a faint smile breaking through his guarded expression. "That's mighty kind, ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly but rich, with a trace of a southern drawl that hinted at roots far from Iowa. "Name's Vernon Tate, and this here's Scout. He's a good boy, just old and a bit wobbly like me. He patted Scout's head, and the dog leaned into him, tail giving a slow, contented wag. Marla led them to a booth near the front, ignoring the curious glances from a few regulars, old Mr. Henshaw, who never missed a chance to grumble, and the Peterson sisters, who whispered over their oatmeal. She noticed Scout's limp, the way his paws hesitated on the linoleum, and the careful way Vernon guided him, as if the dog's comfort mattered more than his own. "You a veteran, Mr. Tate?" she asked, gesturing to his cap as she set a glass of water on the table. "Marines, ma'am. Vietnam. 69 to 72, Vernon replied, his tone matter-of-fact, like he was stating the weather. "Scout's been with me since I got back. He's more than a pet, he's family. Kept me sane when the world didn't make sense." Marla's heart stirred, a flicker of recognition passing through her. She didn't mention her own service, but the shared weight of their pasts hung between them, unspoken, but understood. "Well, you and Scout are welcome here," she said, her smile deepening. "Let me get you some coffee, and I'll see if we've got a little something for him, too. Maybe a scrap of bacon, if he's not too picky." Vernon's eyes crinkled, a rare warmth breaking through. "He's never turned down bacon yet. Thank you, ma'am." As Marla turned toward the counter, her steps light with purpose, a shadow loomed from the kitchen. Dwight Carver, the diner's manager, pushed through the swinging doors, his wiry frame taut with irritation. At 38, Dwight was younger than most of the staff, with a permanent scowl that seemed etched into his face and a habit of snapping orders like a drill sergeant with none of the honor. He'd taken over Brewster's a year ago, bringing with him a relentless focus on efficiency that meant smaller portions, fewer breaks, and a coldness that clashed with the diner's homey charm. His dark hair was slicked back, and his tie was perpetually crooked, as if he couldn't be bothered to care. Dwight's eyes zeroed in on Vernon and Scout, his scowl deepening. "Marla!" he barked, striding across the diner, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "What's that dog doing in here? You know we don't allow pets. Health code violation, plain as day." The diner quieted, forks pausing, heads turning. Marla stopped, her hand still on the coffee pot, and faced him, keeping her voice even. "He's a service dog, Dwight. Mr. Tate's a veteran, and Scout's well-behaved. He's not causing any trouble." Dwight snorted, loud enough to draw more eyes. "Service dog? That mangy thing?" He pointed at Scout, who looked up with a calm gaze, unaware of the insult. "Looks like it wandered out of an alley. Get it out of here now." Marla's jaw tightened, a spark of indignation flaring in her chest. She'd seen men like Dwight before, small men who wielded their sliver of power like a club, oblivious to the weight of others' lives. "Dwight," she said, her tone firm but measured, "the man's just here for breakfast. Scout's not hurting anyone. I'll keep an eye on them." Dwight's face flushed, his voice rising, carrying an edge of cruelty. "I don't care if he's the mayor, Marla. No dogs in my diner. You want to play hero? Do it on your own time." He turned to Vernon, pointing. "Sir, take your dog and leave, or I'm calling the cops." The words landed like a slap, and the diner fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Mr. Henshaw coughed into his napkin. The Peterson sisters exchanged wide-eyed glances, and a young couple at the counter shifted uncomfortably. Vernon's hand tightened on Scout's collar, his knuckles whitening, but his face remained unreadable, a mask of weathered calm. "Didn't mean to cause trouble," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the sting of Dwight's words. "Just wanted a coffee and a bite for me and Scout." Marla's heart ached, not just for Vernon but for the countless others like him. Veterans dismissed, their sacrifices reduced to a nuisance. She stepped forward, her voice low but resolute. "Dwight, you're blowing this out of proportion. I'll cover their meal myself if it's such a problem. Just let them stay." Dwight wheeled on her, his eyes blazing. "You don't make the rules here, Marla. I'm the manager, and I say the dog goes. Keep pushing, and you're out of a job." His words echoed in the quiet, a threat that felt like a blade held to her throat. Marla's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She'd faced worse than Dwight Carver. Mortar fire, screaming wounded, the weight of lives in her hands. But this was different. This was a betrayal of something deeper, a disregard for decency that cut to her core. "Fired for showing a little kindness?" she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's what we're doing now, Dwight? Kicking out a veteran and his dog because you're having a bad day?" Dwight's sneer widened, but before he could respond, Marla knelt beside Scout, her movements deliberate. The dog looked up at her, his eyes trusting, and she scratched his ears gently, her heart pounding. "Come on, buddy," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Let's get you some water out back." She glanced at Vernon, who nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and resignation. As she rose, she grabbed a bowl from the counter, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a fury she hadn't felt in years. She filled the bowl at the sink, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a dog or a meal. It was about respect, about honoring those who'd given everything, about refusing to let the world's indifference win. She led Scout toward the rear exit, Vernon following, his steps heavy but dignified. Outside, in the narrow alley behind the diner, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of garbage and motor oil. Marla set the bowl down on the cracked pavement, and Scout lapped at it gratefully, his tail giving a weak wag. Vernon leaned against the brick wall, his cap pulled low, his face shadowed. "You didn't have to do that, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate it, but I don't want you losing your job over me." Marla shook her head, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It's not about the job, Mr. Tate. It's about what's right. You served this country. You and Scout deserve better than being treated like you're invisible." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I've seen too many good people pushed aside because folks like Dwight think they can." Vernon studied her for a long moment, then nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You're a rare one, Marla Hensley," he said quietly. "Not many would stand up like that." Before Marla could respond, the back door slammed open, and Dwight stormed out, his face twisted with rage. "Marla, you're done!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger. "Fired! Clean out your locker and get off my property, or I'll have you dragged out!" Marla stood slowly, her heart pounding but her face calm, a nurse's composure honed under fire. "Fired for giving a dog a bowl of water?" she said, her voice laced with biting irony. "That's a new low, Dwight. Even for you." Dwight stepped closer, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think you're untouchable because you're old and everyone likes you? You're nothing, Marla. Just a washed-up waitress who doesn't know her place. Now get out before I make you." Vernon shifted, his voice low but firm. "That's no way to talk to a lady, son. You'd do well to watch your tone." Dwight laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the alley walls. "Oh, perfect. The old man's gonna lecture me now. You two are a match made in heaven. Has been sticking up for a scruffy mutt. Get lost, both of you." Marla felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, but she held it in check, her years of discipline keeping her steady. She looked at Vernon, then at Scout, who was still drinking from the bowl, his trust in them unshaken. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. With deliberate care, she untied her apron, folded it over her arm, and straightened. Her head held high. "You're making a mistake, Dwight," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a warning. A big one. As she and Vernon walked back toward the front of the diner, the morning air felt charged, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The regulars inside were still watching through the windows, some whispering, others shaking their heads. Marla didn't look back. She'd faced worse than Dwight Carver in her life, and she wasn't about to let him break her. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her heart was heavy. Not for herself, but for Vernon, for Scout, for every soul the world tried to erase. The late morning sun climbed higher over Eldridge, Iowa, its rays cutting through the haze of dust and exhaust that hung over Juniper Avenue. The sidewalk outside Brewster's Diner, still warm from the early heat, bore the scuff marks of countless boots, a testament to the small town's steady rhythm. But today, that rhythm was broken, replaced by a charged silence that crackled like static. Marla Hensley stood on the pavement, her faded apron folded over her arm like a discarded flag, her gray bun catching the light as she held her head high. At 68, she carried the weight of a life shaped by service and loss, her hazel eyes sharp with a fury she kept tightly reined. Beside her, Vernon Tate, his Marine Corps cap tilted low, rested a weathered hand on Scout, his old dog, whose graying muzzle pressed against his boot. The dog's limp was more pronounced now, his trembling legs a quiet reminder of time's relentless march. Marla's chest ached, not from fear, but from the raw injustice of it all. She'd lost her job, her lifeline in a town where work for a woman her age was scarce. But it wasn't the money that stung most. It was the dismissal of Vernon's dignity. The way Dwight Carver had reduced a veteran to a bum and his loyal companion to a mangy mutt. She'd seen that kind of callousness before, doctors ignoring wounded soldiers, bureaucrats shrugging off pleas for help. Back in Vietnam, she'd fought it with bandages and grit. Today, she fought it with words and a stubborn refusal to bow. Vernon, for his part, stood quiet, his face a mask of stoic calm, but his knuckles, white around Scout's collar, betrayed the storm beneath. "You shouldn't have to go through this, Mr. Tate," Marla said, her voice low, laced with a bitterness she couldn't quite hide. "A man who served his country, treated like he's nothing, makes my blood boil." Vernon's eyes met hers, deep-set and steady, carrying the weight of years unspoken. "I've seen worse, Miss Hensley," he said, his southern drawl soft but resolute. "Folks like that, manager, they don't know what they're tearing down. But you standing up for Scout and me, that's worth more than 100 of their kind." Marla's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through her anger. "Well, if I'm going down swinging," she said, her tone carrying a wry edge, the kind of humor that comes from surviving life's hardest punches. "But I'll be damned if I let Dwight Carver think he's won." Before Vernon could reply, the diner's door jangled open, the bells chime sharp and grating in the tense air. Dwight Carver stormed out, his wiry frame taut with self-righteous fury, his crooked tie swinging like a pendulum. Behind him trailed Corey Phelps, a lanky 19-year-old busboy with acne-scarred cheeks and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. Corey's eyes darted to the ground, his discomfort plain, but he stayed silent, tethered to Dwight's authority like a reluctant shadow. The crowd, regulars spilling out from the diner, a delivery driver leaning against his van, and a handful of passers-by, formed a loose semicircle, their whispers buzzing like flies. Mrs. Delaney, the retired librarian with her ever-present pearl earrings, clutched her purse, her lips pursed in disapproval, while the Peterson sisters hovered near the diner's entrance, their oatmeal long forgotten. Dwight's scowl deepened as he spotted Marla and Vernon still standing there, defiant. "You're still here?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. "I told you to get off my property, Marla. And you," he jabbed a finger at Vernon, his sneer twisting, "take that flea-bitten dog and clear out before I call Sheriff Dawson. I'm not playing games." Marla's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms, but her voice remained steady, sharp with the kind of precision that comes from years of holding ground under pressure. "Games, Dwight. You're the one turning a simple breakfast into a circus. You think throwing out a veteran and firing me makes you look like a big man? All it does is show everyone here how small you are." The crowd stirred, a low murmur rippling through. Mrs. Delaney nodded faintly, and a farmer in a faded John Deere cap muttered something to his friend. But no one spoke up, their silence a heavy weight that pressed on Marla's shoulders. She'd seen this before. People watching, waiting, too afraid or indifferent to act. It was the same silence that had greeted wounded soldiers when they returned home, their sacrifices met with shrugs instead of gratitude. Dwight's face flushed a deeper red, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You're nobody, Marla!" he hissed, stepping closer, his voice dripping with venom. Just an old woman who thinks she's special because she pours coffee and smiles at drunks. And him? He jerked his head toward Vernon, his lip curling. He's just some homeless guy with a sob story and a dog that's one step from the pound. I don't care about his war stories, and neither does anyone else. The words cut deep, each one a deliberate jab meant to wound. Marla felt her temper flare, hot and fierce, but she held it in check. Her nurse's discipline a lifeline. Vernon's jaw tightened, his hand still on Scout's collar, but he didn't speak. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the kind of restraint that comes from knowing your worth, even when others don't. Scout, sensing the tension, let out a low whine, his head pressing closer to Vernon's leg. Before Marla could respond, a harsh laugh broke the silence, sharp and mocking. Across the street, leaning against a battered pickup truck, stood Travis Boone, a local mechanic with grease-stained hands and a reputation for running his mouth. His flannel shirt was untucked, his boots caked with mud, and his smirk was all teeth, like a wolf sizing up prey. He sauntered over, his steps lazy but deliberate, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Well, damn, Dwight, you're putting on one hell of a show," he drawled, crossing his arms. "Kicking out an old lady and a guy with a dog? That's some serious big man energy right there." His tone was laced with sarcasm, but it wasn't aimed at Dwight. It was meant to twist the knife, to make Marla and Vernon the punchline. A few in the crowd chuckled, their laughter nervous but emboldened by Travis's bravado. Marla's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You got something to say, Travis! Say it to my face!" she snapped, her tone sharp enough to silence the murmurs. "Or are you just here to laugh at a veteran getting kicked to the curb? Real classy, even for you." Travis raised his hands, feigning innocence, but his smirk didn't waver. "Whoa, easy, Marla. I'm just saying, maybe the old guy should have known better than to drag a mutt into a diner. Rules are rules, right?" He glanced at Dwight, who nodded, his smugness returning like a bad habit. The two fed off each other, their cruelty a performance for the crowd. Marla's heart pounded, her anger a living thing clawing at her chest. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for Vernon, for Scout, for every person who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't fit some narrow idea of important. She took a step forward, her voice low, but carrying the weight of her years. "Rules don't mean you throw out decency, Travis. You and Dwight think you can bully your way through life, but you're not as tough as you think. You're just loud." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of agreement and unease. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Marla's right," she said, her pearl earrings catching the light. "This isn't how we treat people in Eldridge. You should be ashamed, Dwight." But her words were drowned out by Travis's laugh, sharp and cruel, and the crowd's hesitation held firm. Dwight seized the moment, his voice rising to a shout. "You're done, Marla! I'm calling the sheriff right now, and you'll be lucky if I don't press charges for trespassing." He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking with rage, and began dialing. "And you, old man," he turned to Vernon, "you're not welcome here. Never were." Vernon's eyes flicked up, meeting Dwight's with a calm that was almost unnerving. "Son," he said, his voice low, steady, "I've faced men with guns who scared me less than you think you do. I'm a Marine. I don't run from a fight." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and for a moment, even Dwight faltered, his bravado flickering. But he recovered quickly, his sneer returning. "A Marine? That was 50 years ago. You're nothing now, and neither is she." He gestured at Marla, his voice dripping with disdain. "Get moving, both of you, or you'll regret it." Marla's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a fury that burned white-hot. She'd faced worse than Dwight Carver, mortar shells, screaming wounded, the weight of lives in her hands. But this was a different kind of battle, one fought with words and dignity. She looked at Vernon, his quiet strength a mirror to her own, and then at Scout, whose trusting eyes reminded her why she'd stood up in the first place. The crowd watched, their phones out, some recording, others whispering, but none stepping forward. The silence was a weight, heavy and suffocating, and Marla felt the injustice like a physical thing, pressing down on her chest. She straightened, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're wrong, Dwight," she said, her tone laced with a biting irony that only comes from a life of hard-won wisdom. "You think you're in control because you've got a title and a temper? You're not running a diner. You're running a show, and it's a pathetic one. But go ahead, call the sheriff. Let's see how that plays out when the whole town hears you fired a woman for giving a veteran's dog a bowl of water." The crowd stirred, a few nods rippling through, but Dwight's face twisted with rage. "You're finished, Marla," he spat. "You and your hero act. Get out of my sight." Marla didn't move, her feet rooted to the pavement, her resolve unshaken. She'd faced worse than this, and she wasn't about to let a man like Dwight Carver break her. But as she stood there, the weight of the moment pressed down. The loss of her job, the humiliation of Vernon, the indifference of the crowd. It wasn't just a diner. It was a battlefield, and she was fighting for more than herself. The late morning sun beat down on Juniper Avenue in Eldridge, Iowa, its unrelenting glare turning the cracked sidewalk into a shimmering mirage of heat. The air was thick with the mingled scents of asphalt, exhaust, and the faint grease from Brewster's Diner, where tension hung like a storm cloud ready to break. Marla Hensley stood resolute, her faded apron still draped over her arm like a badge of defiance, her gray bun gleaming under the harsh light. At 68, she carried the weight of a life shaped by sacrifice, years as a nurse in Vietnam, stitching wounds under fire, and decades of quiet service in this small town. Her hazel eyes burned with a fire that belied her age, a mix of fury and unyielding dignity. Beside her, Vernon Tate, his Marine Corps cap casting a shadow over his weathered face, rested a steady hand on Scout, his old dog, whose trembling legs and graying muzzle spoke of loyalty that time couldn't erode. The crowd, regulars, passers-by, a delivery driver leaning against his van, formed a loose semicircle, their whispers a low buzz, their phones raised to capture the unfolding drama. Marla's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a righteous anger that felt like it could split the pavement beneath her feet. Dwight Carver's words still echoed in her ears. His cruel dismissal of Vernon as a bum, his sneering threat to call the sheriff, his firing her for daring to show kindness. She'd faced worse in her life. Mortar shells, dying soldiers, the chaos of war. But this was a different kind of wound. One that cut at the soul. Vernon, for his part, stood like a quiet oak. His silence not weakness, but the kind of strength that comes from knowing your worth, even when the world tries to strip it away. Scout, pressed against his leg, let out a soft whine, sensing the storm brewing around them. Dwight stood a few feet away, his wiry frame taut with self-righteous fury, his crooked tie swinging as he gestured wildly. "You're done, Marla!" he shouted again, his voice cracking with rage. "And you, old man, take that mutt and get out of my sight!" Beside him, Corey Phelps, the young busboy, shifted uncomfortably, his acne-scarred face flushed as he avoided Marla's gaze. Travis Boone, the mechanic with a smirk as sharp as a blade, leaned against his pickup across the street, his mocking laughter still lingering in the air. The crowd watched, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, but none stepped forward. Mrs. Delaney, the retired librarian, clutched her purse, her pearl earrings glinting as she shook her head, but even her quiet disapproval felt like a drop in the ocean of indifference. Marla's voice when she spoke was low and steady, laced with the biting irony of a woman who'd seen too much to be cowed by a man like Dwight. "You keep saying you're diner, Dwight, but you're not running a business. You're running a tantrum. You think firing me and humiliating a veteran makes you powerful? It just makes you look like a coward who picks on those you think can't fight back." Her words cut through the murmurs, and a few in the crowd nodded, their faces tightening with unease. Dwight's eyes narrowed, his face reddening further. "You're nobody, Marla!" he spat, stepping closer, his finger jabbing the air. Just an old waitress who thinks she's a hero because she pours coffee. And him? He pointed at Vernon, his lip curling. He's nothing but a has-been with a sob story and a dog that's one step from the grave. You're both pathetic. The words were a deliberate wound, meant to break, but Vernon's expression didn't waver. His hand tightened on Scout's collar, his knuckles whitening, but his voice, when he spoke, was calm, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced death and come out the other side. "Son," he said, his southern drawl slow and deliberate, "I've stared down men with more guts than you'll ever have. You don't scare me, but you're making a fool of yourself, and that's a shame." Before Dwight could retort, a low rumble broke the tense silence, growing louder until it drowned out the whispers of the crowd. Heads turned toward the end of Juniper Avenue, where a black SUV with tinted windows rolled into view, its tires crunching on the gravel-strewn street. Behind it came a dusty Jeep, its Marine Corps sticker faded but unmistakable, glinting in the sunlight. The vehicles pulled to the curb with a decisive thud, their engines cutting off like a held breath. The crowd parted instinctively, their murmurs rising to a fevered pitch, phones raised higher to capture whatever was about to unfold. The SUV's door swung open, and out stepped a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and commanding, his presence like a storm front rolling in. He wore a crisp navy polo and jeans, his dark hair cropped close, his eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. His posture was unmistakably military, every movement deliberate, every glance weighted with authority. Behind him, 3 younger men climbed out of the Jeep, their casual clothes, faded t-shirts, cargo pants, belied by the disciplined way they carried themselves. One, a wiry man with a scar across his knuckles, wore a Marine Corps t-shirt with the sleeves cut off, revealing a tattoo of an eagle, globe, and anchor. Another, taller and lean, had a buzz cut and a quiet intensity that made the crowd step back. The third, stocky with a sunburned neck, cracked his knuckles, his eyes fixed on Dwight. The man from the SUV strode forward, his gaze locking onto Vernon. "Gunnery Sergeant Tate?" he called, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. The crowd fell silent, the air electric with anticipation. Vernon's head snapped up, his deep-set eyes widening with recognition. "Captain Hargrove?" he replied, his gravelly voice tinged with surprise. He straightened, his stooped shoulders pulling back as if decades of instinct kicked in. Scout's tail gave a slow wag, sensing the shift in his owner's mood. "Didn't expect to see you here, sir." Hargrove's stern face softened, a faint smile breaking through. "Heard you were passing through Eldridge, Gunny. Thought we'd catch you for lunch at the VFW. Didn't expect to find you in the middle of this." He gestured to the scene, his eyes flicking to Dwight, then to Marla, then back to Vernon. "What's going on here?" Dwight, his bravado faltering, stepped forward, his voice loud but unsteady. "This is private property," he snapped, pointing at Vernon and Marla. "These 2 are trespassing. I told them to leave, and they're refusing. I'm calling the sheriff." Hargrove turned to Dwight, his gaze cold and unyielding, like a predator sizing up prey. "Your property," he said, his tone calm but laced with steel. "You're the one who kicked out a decorated Marine and fired a woman for showing basic decency. I'd say you're the one who needs to explain himself." The crowd gasped, the murmurs turning into a wave of shock. Mrs. Delaney's hand flew to her mouth, and the Peterson sisters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Travis Boone's smirk vanished, his arms uncrossing as he shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the shift in the air. Marla felt a surge of hope, faint but growing, as she watched Hargrove's commanding presence reshape the moment. The wiry Marine with the tattoo, Javier Ruiz, as Marla would later learn, stepped forward, his voice low but fierce. "You know who this man is," he said, nodding at Vernon. "Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Tate, Vietnam. 71. Took shrapnel to the leg, saving my CO's life. Carried him 2 miles through a firefight to a medevac. That's the man you're calling a bum." His words were a challenge, each one landing like a punch, and the crowd's murmurs turned to gasps of awe. Dwight's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "He didn't say anything about that. He just brought a dog in And you didn't ask," Marla cut in, her voice sharp with the weight of her anger. She stepped forward, her apron still clutched in her hands, her eyes blazing. "You saw an old man and a dog and decided they weren't worth your time. You fired me for giving Scout a bowl of water, Dwight. You tell me, who's the one who doesn't belong here?" The crowd's mood shifted, a tide turning. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward, her voice trembling with conviction. "Marla's right," she called, her pearl earrings catching the light. "She's been the heart of this diner for years, Dwight. You're a disgrace, treating her and this veteran like trash." A farmer in a faded cap nodded, and a young woman in the crowd murmured, "Shameful." The whispers grew into a chorus, a quiet rebellion against Dwight's cruelty. Hargrove raised a hand, silencing the crowd with a single gesture. "Here's how this is going to go," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, like a general issuing orders. "Mr. Tate and Miss Hensley are coming inside to have the meal they were denied. Scout, too. And you," he fixed Dwight with a stare that could have cracked stone, "are going to apologize. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do." Dwight's jaw dropped, his eyes darting to the crowd, then to the Marines, then to Marla and Vernon. "You can't make me do anything," he muttered. But his voice was weak, his authority crumbling like dry sand. Javier stepped closer, his scarred knuckles flexing, his tone low and dangerous. "You sure about that? Because I know a lot of folks who'd love to hear how you treat veterans in this town. Word travels fast these days. Twitter, Facebook, you name it." The threat hung heavy, and Dwight's shoulders slumped, his bravado shattered. He looked around, realizing he was alone. Travis had melted into the crowd. Corey was staring at his shoes, and even the regulars were turning against him. "Fine," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disrespect anyone." Vernon looked at him, his expression unreadable, his deep-set eyes piercing. "It ain't about me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime. "It's about her." He nodded at Marla. "She stood up for what's right when you tried to tear us down. You owe her more than words." Marla felt a lump in her throat, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. Hargrove turned to her, his stern face softening. "Miss Hensley, I heard what you did back there. Sticking your neck out like that takes guts. Army nurse, Vietnam, right? Bronze Star for pulling a soldier out of a firefight?" Marla's cheeks flushed, her past catching up to her like an unexpected guest. She'd never spoken of her service, never wanted the spotlight, but now, standing on Juniper Avenue with a crowd watching and a Marine captain looking at her with respect, she felt a spark of pride she hadn't allowed herself in years. "That was a long time ago," she said softly, her voice thick. "But yes." The crowd gasped again, phones lowering as awe replaced curiosity. Mrs. Delaney wiped her eyes, and the farmer in the cap removed his hat, holding it to his chest. Hargrove nodded, his smile warm but restrained. "Word gets around, Miss Hensley. You and Gunny Tate are cut from the same cloth. This town's lucky to have you." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "This woman and this man deserve better than what they got today. So here's what we're doing. Lunch is on us. Inside. For anyone who wants to join. And Dwight," he fixed the manager with a hard stare, "you're welcome to serve, but you're not calling the shots today." The crowd erupted in cheers, a wave of applause breaking the tension. Mrs. Delaney clapped her hands, tears streaming down her face, and the Peterson sisters hugged each other, their faces alight with relief. The Marines led the way back into the diner, Vernon and Scout at the center, Marla walking beside them, her head high. As they stepped inside, the regulars stood, some saluting, others clapping, their voices a chorus of respect. Dwight slunk to the back, his authority shattered, while Corey rushed to set up a table, his hands shaking but his face bright with purpose. Marla sat across from Vernon, who gave her a nod, his eyes warm with gratitude. "You're one hell of a woman, Marla Hensley," he said, his voice soft but firm, the kind of praise that carried weight. Scout, lying at his feet, let out a contented sigh as Corey set down a plate of bacon scraps, his tail thumping against the floor. Marla smiled, her heart full, the weight of the morning lifting like fog burning off under the sun. "Just doing what's right, Mr. Tate," she said, her voice steady. "Same as you." As the diner filled with laughter, conversation, and the clink of plates, the air felt lighter, charged with a warmth that spread from table to table. Justice hadn't come with fists or shouts, but with dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of those who'd given everything for others. Marla looked around, at Vernon, at Scout, at the faces of the people she'd served for years, and felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope.